On January 30th, 2026, the United States government released 3 million pages of documents relating to a case involving large-scale crimes against minors, 2,000 video recordings, 180,000 photographs, and almost half of the names in these documents are blacked out. Not the names of the victims, the names of those who were close to him, those who came to his island, flew on his plane, and dined at his table. My name is Mr. Dark Web, and today I'm going to show you what's hidden behind the black rectangles in Epstein's files, and why those who black them out fear a simple copy and paste more than any court of law. I have long been involved in topics that most people prefer to ignore: the dark web, digital scams, shady schemes. All of this is part of my job. But when I first opened Epstein's file archive, I realized that this was on a whole other level. This is not a story about one criminal. This is a story about a system. A system that for 2 decades protected those who should have been behind bars. A system that even after the death of its main figure continued to hide names. And a system that was ultimately let down by basic technical incompetence. To give you an idea of the scale, 3.5 million pages is a stack of paper 2 Eiffel Towers high. That is how Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche described the volume at a press conference on January 30th. 6 million pages were identified as potentially relevant to the case. The Ministry of Justice decided not to publish half of them. The reasons? Materials containing evidence of crimes, internal investigation documents, attorney-client privilege, and something they call deliberative process privilege. Anything could be hidden behind each of these terms, from truly sensitive data to names that someone really doesn't want to see in the public domain. But before we dive into the files themselves, we need to understand the context. Jeffrey Epstein is a financier convicted of crimes against minors, a man whose address book read like a guest list for a White House reception, a man who owned a private island in the Caribbean, a mansion in Manhattan, and a private jet that the press dubbed with a certain name, which I will not repeat here. His connections stretched from Wall Street to Buckingham Palace, from Silicon Valley to the academic circles of Harvard. And when he was arrested in 2019 on charges of human trafficking, the whole world held its breath. Because everyone understood that if Epstein started talking, figures of such caliber would come to light that no one would be spared. He did not speak. On the 10th of August, 2019, he was found dead in his cell in a federal prison in Manhattan. The official version is suicide, but we will return to this topic later, in detail. For now, remember one figure: 6 million pages. That is how many documents the government has collected over 2 decades of investigations. And when Congress finally passed a law requiring them to be published, the Ministry of Justice decided to release only half. The question that keeps me awake at night is, what's in those other 3 million? And more importantly, who exactly doesn't want us to know? Because behind every redacted line, there is not some abstract state secret. Behind it are real people. Some are victims whose lives have been destroyed. Others are those who destroyed those lives. And Epstein's files are perhaps the only chance to separate the former from the latter. If, of course, we are allowed to do so. But when the files began to appear on the Ministry of Justice website, 16 of them disappeared within the first day, without any explanation. To understand why these 3 million pages ended up in the public domain, we need to rewind time. Because the publication of Epstein's files was not motivated by a noble desire for transparency. Behind it lies a political battle lasting many months, in which both sides, Republicans and Democrats, alternately demanded the truth and tried to bury it. It all began during the 2024 election campaign. Donald Trump and his allies repeatedly promised that if they returned to the White House, Epstein's files would be made public. J.D. Vance stated at the convention that the Biden administration was hiding Epstein's client list. Donald Trump Jr. accused the current government of protecting criminals. Kash Patel, one of Trump's closest advisors, claimed that the FBI was deliberately hiding the documents. It was powerful rhetoric, and it worked. When Trump returned to the White House, the new Attorney General Pam Bondi stated on Fox News in February 2025 that Epstein's files, and I quote, were on her desk, and she was personally reviewing them. It sounded like a promise. The public was waiting for revelations. The FBI began a massive review of about 100,000 documents, and then something happened that no one expected. On July 7, 2025, the Ministry of Justice and the FBI issued a joint memorandum. It stated that there was no client list in Epstein's files. There was no evidence of blackmail. There were no grounds for new charges, and his death was confirmed as suicide. Period. The reaction was, to put it mildly, heated. And on both sides, conservative commentators called it treason. One of them, a man who at the time held the position of deputy director of the FBI, reportedly had a heated confrontation with Bondi over her approach to the files. He was later demoted, and a few months later he announced his resignation. Democrats, in turn, accused the administration of concealing information that could be inconvenient for the president himself. And that's when Congressman Thomas Massie stepped in. On September 2, 2025, the first day after the House of Representatives' summer recess, he initiated a procedure known as a forced vote petition, a mechanism that allows Congress to vote on a bill even if the leadership does not want to. The bill was simply called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Then the pressure began. According to sources, the Trump administration launched a campaign against the petition. One anonymous official called signing the petition an extremely hostile act towards the administration. But that didn't help. One after another, members of Congress from both parties signed the petition. Even some of Trump's most ardent supporters were among the signatories. One of them wrote on social media that Epstein's network, linked to exploitation and human trafficking, must be exposed at all costs. She added a chilling phrase: "If anything happens to me, please find out who tried to stop this information from being published." On the 18th of November, 2025, the House of Representatives voted 427 in favor and 1 against. The next day, the Senate unanimously approved the bill. Trump signed it that same evening. No cameras, no journalists. The bill required the Attorney General to release all files within 30 days. The deadline was the 19th of December. On the 19th of December, the Ministry of Justice did indeed publish the first batch of documents. But what appeared on the website caused shock. Of the thousands of pages, more than 500 were completely blacked out, from the first line to the last. 255 pages in a row were solid black rectangles. The 119-page grand jury report was completely blacked out. This was not a publication. According to critics, it was a mockery of the law. During the first day, 16 files disappeared from the website without explanation. According to press reports, among them was a photograph depicting the current president. It was later restored, but the damage had already been done. The criticism was bipartisan and relentless. A congressman, one of the authors of the law, stated that the Department of Justice had released less than 1% of the total volume of files. A group of lawyers representing the victims called the publication, and I quote, "riddled with anomalous and extreme edits without any explanation." And then, under pressure from all sides, on 30 January 2026, the DOJ released the main body of evidence, 3 million pages, 2,000 video recordings, and 180,000 images. 500 lawyers worked on preparing this dump. 500 lawyers, thousands of hours of work, all for one purpose: to decide which names the world will see and which it will not. But they didn't take one thing into account: the fact that the internet can read what has been covered up, and that you don't need a hacker or a special service to do this. All you need is someone who can simply click, copy, and paste. When you open Epstein's files on the Ministry of Justice website, the first thing that catches your eye is not the text. It's black rectangles. They're everywhere. Entire paragraphs blacked out from edge to edge. Names crossed out of correspondence. Faces covered with squares and photographs. Pages with not a single legible word left. And if you look at it long enough, it starts to seem that the files themselves are not documents. They are a map of what is being hidden from you. Let's figure out what exactly has been covered up and according to what logic. Because the logic here, to put it mildly, raises questions. The Epstein Files Transparency Act allows the Department of Justice to redact documents only in a few cases: victims' personal data, materials containing evidence of crimes against minors, and information that could jeopardize an active investigation. Deputy Attorney General Blanche stated clearly at a press conference that the faces of all women except Ghislaine Maxwell were blurred in the images and videos. The faces of the men were left untouched. Unless, of course, it was impossible to blur a woman without also blurring a man standing next to her. It sounds logical, until you start reading the documents themselves. The files contain an internal FBI document compiled in August 2019, 5 days after Epstein's death. It lists 9 people from his inner circle. 8 of them are identified as accomplices, and 7 of the 8 have their names and faces blacked out. The only ones who can be identified are Ghislaine Maxwell and Jean-Luc Brunel, a French modeling agent who was later found dead in a Paris prison cell under circumstances that, let's say, also raised a lot of questions. There is also an organizational chart, the Epstein Inner Circle diagram prepared by the FBI. It shows Maxwell, Leslie Groff, a personal assistant, and an accountant. But several other figures are completely blurred out. Who are they? Why are their faces hidden if, according to the DOJ, only victims are blurred out? And here we come to the main paradox of these files. A paradox that, to be honest, makes one feel uncomfortable. The Department of Justice stated that all names that were completely redacted were those of victims. However, one DOJ representative added a phrase that changes everything. He said, and I am paraphrasing closely, in many cases, those who were initially victims subsequently became participants and accomplices. That is, according to the DOJ's logic, if a person started out as a victim and was then drawn into the recruitment system, their name is redacted as a victim's name, even if they helped find new victims, even if the documents describe exactly how they did it. One of the most anticipated documents in this dump is a draft indictment prepared by Florida federal prosecutors in the mid-2000s. 56 pages long, it was intended to bring charges against Epstein and 3 of his personal assistants. The charges were that they had conspired to induce minors to engage in sexual activity. The names of all 3 assistants are redacted. This indictment was never filed. Instead, prosecutor Alexander Acosta signed a deal that allowed Epstein to avoid federal prosecution. The correspondence posted as part of the dump includes letters that make your blood run cold. One of them, dated 2013, was sent to Epstein by someone from a Paris modeling agency. It mentions a new Brazilian who is 19 years old. The sender's name is blacked out. Another letter, from 2018, addressed to Epstein, contains a phrase that I will quote as closely as possible to the original. I found at least 3 very good young poor girls. And further, meet this one. Not the one from the beauty contest, but we both liked her. The author's name is a black rectangle. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. Lawyers representing hundreds of victims immediately discovered that the Ministry of Justice had failed to protect those it was obliged to protect. The names and personal details of at least 31 victims were made publicly available, unredacted. Women who had never appeared in public, whose names had never been mentioned in the press, were suddenly identified. Their families learned details that should not have been made public. Their children could find these documents on the internet. The brother of Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, who took her own life in 2025, said in an interview that the DOJ is covering up the names of those who committed crimes and revealing the names of those who were victimized. According to him, this is the exact opposite of what the transparency law was intended to achieve. The Deputy Attorney General later admitted that mistakes had been made. He said that his department was working around the clock to rectify cases of unintentional disclosure of information about victims. But for those whose names had already appeared on the screens of millions of people around the world, these words came too late. Conclusion: the names of the accomplices are hidden behind black rectangles. The names of the victims are visible. The system that was supposed to ensure justice has once again protected the wrong people. But what is blurred on the screen is not always blurred in the file code. And this was discovered by someone who simply clicked copy. A few hours after Epstein's files were first published in December 2025, an internet commentator posted on social media, beginning with the words, "You won't believe how I removed these edits." His method did not require any hacking skills. It did not require special software. It did not even require a basic understanding of information security. He simply selected the redacted text in the PDF file, copied it, and pasted it into a regular text document. The black rectangles disappeared. The text underneath remained. It sounds like a joke, but it's not a joke. It's the reality of how the world's largest law enforcement system prepared to publish the most sensitive documents in decades. To understand what happened, you need to know one thing about how PDF files are structured. It's not just a picture on the screen. A PDF is a multi-layered document. It has a visible layer, just what you see, and it has an internal structure: text, metadata, attachments. When you want to truly cover something up in a PDF, you can't just put a black rectangle over the text. You have to delete the text itself from the internal structure of the file. Otherwise, it remains there, invisible to the eye, but completely accessible to anyone who knows how the clipboard works. This is exactly what happened with some of Epstein's files. Black rectangles were superimposed over the text, but the text itself was not deleted from the file. All you had to do was select the blacked out area, click Copy, open Notepad, and click Paste. That's it. A state secret worth millions of dollars and thousands of hours of work by 500 lawyers was revealed with a combination of 2 keys. But that was only the first method. There was a second one. Some documents were scanned from paper media. That is, the editing consisted of black stripes applied directly to the image. It would seem that nothing could be done about this. But users discovered that if you take a screenshot of such a page and open it in a regular photo editor on your phone, then when you increase the brightness and decrease the contrast, the text under the black stripes begins to show through. It's as if someone had smudged the document not with black ink, but with a gray pencil. And the third method is the most unexpected. A computer forensics expert and founder of a technology company discovered that the DOJ had published some of Epstein's emails in their raw form. That is, together with the source code, which included attachments encoded in base 64 format. This is a standard way of transferring files via email. Images, PDF documents, and other attachments are converted into long strings of characters that are transmitted along with the text of the email. The person who prepared the documents for publication apparently did not realize that these pages with seemingly meaningless strings of code were not junk. These are encrypted attachments that can be recovered. And that is exactly what enthusiasts began to do. Decrypt attachments from emails that the Ministry of Justice probably considered harmless. As this expert noted, the DOJ does not appear to have assigned its best people to this task. But, and this is important, the PDF Association, an international organization that deals with PDF format standards, conducted its own analysis and concluded that the January batch of files had been edited correctly. The black blocks in the January dump were applied directly to the image pixels, not on top of the text layer. In other words, the DOJ took the December errors into account and corrected them in January. The problem with the incomplete edits primarily affected the December batch and some of the documents that were originally published as part of other court cases and simply included in the general archive. And here we need to mention another critically important point. Not everything that enthusiasts revealed on social media turned out to be true. One of the documents that was actively circulated as a sensational discovery from Epstein's files was actually an appendix to Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit against Maxwell and had been declassified back in 2024. It contained the testimony of a woman who claimed that there were compromising recordings involving famous people. Later, the same woman stated that she had fabricated her testimony, but on social media, this nuance was, of course, lost. As one major publication wrote, extracting individual documents from a mass of millions of pages and drawing conclusions based on them is a risky business. Context is what is sorely lacking in this dump. The files are posted without chronological order, without thematic grouping, without explanations. The same DOJ presentation on the Epstein case appears 6 times in the archive, each time with a different level of editing. The same correspondence is duplicated dozens of times. This is not an archive, it is a labyrinth. But even in a maze, you can find your way out, if you know where to look. And while the whole world was poring over PDF files and arguing about whether the disclosed data was genuine, another source existed in parallel. Not a government source, not a judicial source. 18,000 emails from Jeffrey Epstein's personal mailbox. And they revealed things about his network that were not found in any government dump. But the files told not only about the living, They also told about the dead. More precisely, about one particular night when everything that could go wrong went wrong at the same time. While the Ministry of Justice spent months deciding which pages to redact and which to publish, a completely different archive existed in parallel. Not a state archive, not a court archive, a private archive. And it fell into the hands of journalists long before Congress passed the transparency law. In September 2025, one of the world's largest business publications announced that it had gained access to more than 18,000 emails from Jeffrey Epstein's personal mailbox. The account was on one of the oldest email services. The emails covered a 20-year period from 2002 to 2022. However, the bulk of the correspondence was from 2005 to 2008. This was the period when Epstein was under investigation in Florida, negotiating with prosecutors, and ultimately reaching a deal that allowed him to get off with a minimal sentence. Before publishing anything, a team of 7 journalists spent weeks verifying the information: cryptographic analysis, metadata verification, cross-checking with external sources. 4 independent experts evaluated the methodology and concluded that they found no significant signs of falsification. This is important because in an era of deepfakes and manipulation, you can only trust what has been verified multiple times. And what these letters revealed turned the usual picture upside down. Let's start with Ghislaine Maxwell. She repeatedly stated, both in court and in negotiations with the DOJ, that by the mid-2000s, her relationship with Epstein had virtually ended, that she knew nothing about his negotiations with the prosecution, that she was, in essence, his ex-girlfriend who had become the manager of his real estate holdings and nothing more. The letters told a very different story. 650 letters between them, 203 messages in the first half of 2008 alone, the last months before Epstein went to prison. She gave him advice on his defense strategy. She discussed with him which charges he should plead guilty to. They planned a procedure involving reproductive technology together. She helped him wind up his affairs before his imprisonment, and she wrote to him about her devastation at his situation. This is not the behavior of a former acquaintance. This is the behavior of a close partner. But Maxwell is just the tip of the iceberg. The letters revealed an entire ecosystem of people who, in one way or another, served Epstein at the most critical moment of his life. Among his contacts were former White House advisors, well-known lawyers, and academics from leading universities. The correspondence shows how academics from one of the world's most prestigious universities offered Epstein funding for research projects with names that sound like science fiction, studying the neural basis of pleasure, genetic laboratories, experiments at the intersection of biology and philosophy. In exchange for what? In exchange for his money and possibly his silence about how exactly these scientists spent their time on his island. A network of PR specialists was also discovered, who prepared drafts of public apologies for Epstein, none of which he ever uttered. A crisis communications specialist from Texas developed 3 versions of contrite speeches for him. She later stated that she terminated the contract because she felt uncomfortable, but the very fact that such people existed in his orbit, people whose job was to help him appear remorseful, speaks volumes. A separate chapter of the correspondence concerns gifts, nearly 2,000 items, a watch worth tens of thousands of dollars for a former aide to one of the ex-presidents, a car worth $71,000 for a lawyer, purchases for underage girls who later became his accusers. Gifts are not generosity, they are currency. The currency of loyalty, the currency of silence, the currency of dependence. In January, the DOJ also released correspondence involving some big names. A former advisor to the Obama administration helped Epstein arrange a tour of the White House for a well-known director and his wife. A former member of the British royal family, referred to in the correspondence as the Invisible Man, and who signed with a single letter, exchanged letters with Maxwell through an account with a British internet service provider. Epstein tried to arrange a date for him, offering in a letter a friend with whom he would enjoy having dinner. One of the current members of the U.S. cabinet, whose name appears in the documents, said he had only limited contact with Epstein in the presence of his wife. But correspondence showed that they planned a joint dinner on Epstein's private island in the Caribbean in 2012, and that this dinner apparently took place. I want to emphasize, the mention in Epstein's correspondence is not an accusation. It is not proof of a crime. It is not evidence. Many of these people may not have known what was going on behind closed doors, but the very structure of this network, its scale, its ramifications, the number of influential people who considered it normal to maintain contact with a person convicted of crimes against minors. That is what is truly frightening. And behind each of these letters, each lunch on the island, each gift, there are girls whose names the DOJ accidentally made public. Girls for whom all this was not correspondence, but a life that was taken away from them. But these letters told not only about the living, they also told about the dead. More precisely, about one particular night in August 2019, when everything that could go wrong went wrong at the same time. And the files that the world saw in January 2026 showed that night in detail for the first time, in a way that no one had known before. On the 10th of August 2019, at 6:33 in the morning, an alarm button was activated in a special isolation ward of the federal prison in Manhattan. The guard radioed in, "Medical emergency." He added words that are now recorded in FBI documents. Epstein hanged himself. When the senior officer arrived at the scene, one of the guards was already performing CPR. Epstein was taken to the medical unit. The nurse continued CPR until the ambulance arrived. At 7:36 a.m., he was taken to the hospital. There, he was pronounced dead. This is the official chronology. It has been documented, confirmed, and repeatedly verified. But the files published in January 2026 added details to this chronology that transformed the picture from tragic to almost impossible. Let's go through them, step by step, fact by fact. No speculation, only what is recorded in the documents. Fact 1. Cameras. In the special isolation unit where Epstein was held, there were video cameras that transmitted images in real time to security monitors. However, according to the Inspector General's report, system failures meant that virtually all cameras in this block stopped recording video at the end of July 2019, several weeks before his death. The cameras transmitted live images, but did not save them. In other words, the recording that could have shown what happened that night simply does not exist. Fact 2. Security guards. 2 employees assigned to duty that night were supposed to check Epstein's cell every 30 minutes. According to documents, they did not conduct a single check from approximately 10:40 p.m. on the 9th of August until the body was discovered on the morning of the 10th. That is almost 8 hours. One of them, as it turned out later, was not a regular guard. He was hired as a temporary worker and worked several shifts in a row. Both later admitted to falsifying the patrol logs. They wrote down entries about checks they did not perform. Fact 3. Cellmate. After the first incident, when Epstein was found with injuries to his neck at the end of July, the prison's psychological service issued a written order. Epstein must have a cellmate at all times. This order was sent to 70 employees. On 9th August, the day before his death, his cellmate was transferred from the cell. No new cellmate was assigned. Epstein was left alone. The documents do not explain why the direct order of the psychological service was violated. Fact 4. The orange figure. This is one of the most recent discoveries found in the January dump. The video observation log prepared by investigators contains a record that at approximately 10:39 p.m. on the 9th of August, an orange figure, possibly an inmate being escorted upstairs, was seen on the staircase leading to the isolated floor where Epstein's cell was located. FBI analysts described it as a blurry orange image. None of the official reports, neither the FBI's nor the Inspector General's, mention this figure in their conclusions. The guards were not asked about it directly. One of them stated that he did not remember the period between 10 p.m. and midnight. Another said that taking a prisoner upstairs alone would be a violation of protocol. An internal presentation of the investigation suggested that it could have been one of the guards with laundry. But the guard herself stated during questioning, "I never handed out laundry. That's not my job." Fact 5. The last phone call. Documents show that on the evening of 9th August, Epstein made a call from a landline phone that was not subject to monitoring. He told the guards that he was calling his mother. His mother had already passed away by that time. Fact 6. Prisoner count. The special isolation ward log records that the number of prisoners in the block changed from 73 to 72 at some point between 10 o'clock in the evening and midnight. There is no explanation for this change in the documents. And finally, fact number 7, excess bedding. After Epstein's death, an excessive amount of sheets, an extra mattress, and a homemade noose were found in his cell. The protocol required regular cell searches. If they had been carried out, the excess bedding would have been discovered and confiscated. But the searches, like the rounds, apparently existed only on paper. The official position of all investigations conducted by the FBI, the Inspector General, and the New York Medical Examiner is unequivocal. Epstein committed suicide. The pathologists explain in detail why the nature of the injuries is consistent with suicide rather than violent strangulation. There were no signs of a struggle under his fingernails. There were no bruises on the body indicating resistance. I will not draw conclusions for you. That is not my job. My job is to show you the facts. And the facts are as follows. In one of the most secure prisons in the world, the cameras failed simultaneously. Both guards fell asleep. A fellow prisoner disappeared. No searches were conducted. An unexplained figure appeared on the stairs. And the man who knew the names that the whole world is now trying to read under the black rectangles was found dead. Everyone can judge for themselves the likelihood that all this is a coincidence. But one thing we know for sure, his death deprived hundreds of victims of their only chance to hear a guilty verdict in court. And this is not theory. It is a consequence. Real, documented, irreversible. Epstein is dead. But 2.5 million pages about his network remain locked behind a wall of black rectangles and legal privilege. On the 30th of January, 2026, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche came out to the press and uttered a phrase that was supposed to put an end to the matter. He said that the Department of Justice had fulfilled its obligations under the law, that 3.5 million pages had been published, that the work was complete. But the full stop didn't work out. It turned into an ellipsis. Because out of 6 million pages identified as potentially relevant to the case, the world saw just over half. 2.5 million pages remained behind closed doors. The Department of Justice explained this by citing document duplication, the presence of materials unrelated to the case, attorney-client privilege, deliberative process privilege, and the need to protect victims. 200,000 pages were classified as privileged, that is, closed on legal grounds that prevent them from being made public. The congressman who co-authored the transparency law immediately questioned this claim. He stated that if the DOJ had identified 6 million potentially relevant pages, but was only publishing 3.5 million, this raised questions about what exactly was being hidden in the remaining data. He also pointed out that he is still searching the published files for specific documents. Victim interview transcripts prepared by FBI agents, drafts of the 2007 indictment, and files from Epstein's computers. And then another figure appeared. In early February 2026, the Ministry of Justice announced that the Southern District of New York and the FBI had discovered more than 1 million additional documents potentially related to the Epstein case. Another 1 million, on top of the 6 million that were already on the table. DOJ lawyers said they were working around the clock to process them. When they will be published, and whether they will be published at all, remains unanswered. Meanwhile, the published files themselves were a puzzle. They were posted without any system. No chronological order, no thematic grouping, no context. The same internal DOJ presentation on the Epstein case appeared 6 times in the archive, and each copy had a different level of redaction. What was redacted in one version remained legible in another. What was visible in the third disappeared in the fourth. This does not seem like a coincidence. It seems like chaos serving a specific purpose. The more noise, the harder it is to find the signal. The Transparency Act requires the Ministry of Justice to provide Congress with a detailed report on all edits made and their justifications within 15 days of publication. This report must include an unedited list of all government officials and so-called politically significant persons mentioned in the files. The law does not specify what exactly politically significant persons means, and this is probably no accident. But the most unexpected consequence of the dump did not come from Washington. It came from Europe. On the 3rd of February 2026, the president of Lithuania called on law enforcement agencies to launch an investigation into possible human trafficking. This was prompted by reports in the Lithuanian media, which found the names of several Lithuanian models and representatives of the art world in Epstein's files. The Lithuanian prosecutor's office announced the start of an investigation. On February 5th, the president of Latvia took a similar step. Latvian public media discovered passport details and travel information for several Latvian women in the documents. The Latvian state police launched an investigation with the participation of the prosecutor's office and the Organized Crime Bureau. This means that the Epstein files are not just an American story. They are a global web whose threads stretch across continents. And when an archive of 3.5 million pages becomes publicly available, every country begins to find its own names in it, its own faces, its own skeletons. And in the United States itself, there is silence. The Deputy Attorney General stated on one of the major television channels that new charges are unlikely, that the DOJ has reviewed the files and found no grounds to prosecute anyone other than those already convicted, that the whole world can now look at these documents and decide for themselves whether they are right. 3.5 million pages, 2,000 video recordings, 180,000 images, and not a single new charge, not a single arrest, not a single trial. For the system, it's a closed case. For those whose lives have been destroyed, it's an open wound that has just had salt rubbed into it. When I started working on this material, I thought that files would be the main story. Metadata, patchy edits, base 64 codes, PDF forensics, everything that constitutes the essence of digital archaeology. And yes, all of this is important. All of this is part of the story. But the deeper I delved, the clearer it became. The main story wasn't in the files. It was in the silence between the lines, in the pauses between the facts, in the space occupied by those very black rectangles. Behind each of them is not an abstraction. Behind each one is either a person whose life has been destroyed or a person who destroyed that life. And the system that was created to separate the former from the latter has once again confused their places. It has covered up the names of those who should have been named, and it has revealed the names of those it was obliged to protect. We live in an era where data is the new currency, and digital footprints cannot be completely erased. Sooner or later, even the most secure archives become public. And in the case of Epstein's files, that is undoubtedly a good thing. The world deserves to know the truth, but there is a bitter irony in the fact that transparency has come too late. Epstein is dead. Most of his alleged accomplices are behind bars. The only person convicted besides him is Ghislaine Maxwell, who is serving a 20-year sentence. Jean-Luc Brunel is dead, also found in his cell, also in circumstances that raise more questions than they answer. And the victims, those for whom all this was done, find their names in the public domain and receive calls from journalists. 2.5 million pages remain locked away. 1 million new documents have just been found. Lithuania and Latvia have launched investigations. The United States has not. Perhaps time will tell. Perhaps in a year, 5 years, 10 years, we will see what is now hidden. Digital archives are patient. They wait. But for those whose lives have been crippled by the system, time is not an abstraction. It is years lived in the shadow of what has been done to them. And every day that the black rectangles remain in place is another day that the system protects the wrong people. My name is Mr. Dark Web, and I'm not putting a full stop here, because this story isn't over yet.